I'm Lucinda Vakura, Business Development and Marketing Director with the Alford Group. Welcome to our event. Brenda Asare, the Alford Group's President and CEO, will be moderating today's event. Before I hand things over to Brenda, I'm going to tell you a little bit about us, the Alford Group, and walk you through some webinar housekeeping agenda items. So first, I'll tell you a little bit about the Alford Group. Here on the next page, I know many of you are familiar with our firm. For those of you who may not be, we are a national full-service consulting firm specializing in the nonprofit and social sectors. We offer services in fundraising, strategic planning, communications, data analytics, crisis management, and much more. We are an active member and sponsor with the Association of Fundraising Professionals. We are a certified women's business enterprise, and we are, of course, a member of the Giving Institute. You can find more information about the Alford Group on our website, which is alford.com. So today, as we move forward to the next slide, the presentation is titled Giving USA and the New Age of Philanthropy. And before we walk through the agenda, I want to go through a couple of housekeeping items related to the webinar. So first of all, the webinar is being recorded. You will receive a link to the full recording of today's webinar. It'll be posted on our website. You'll also receive an email later today with the full recording, slides from the Giving USA presentation, and the Giving USA infographic. So keep an eye out for that email coming later today. This event is approved for 1.5 credit points towards your CFRE certification or recertification. So please take advantage of that. Immediately following the conclusion of today's webinar, you'll be prompted to take a short survey. The survey really is short, and we appreciate your feedback. It will be very helpful for us for future events. Everyone today joining is in listen-only mode. We will have plenty of time for questions at the end of today's session. If you have a question at any time throughout the session, please use the Q&A function to send us your questions. So along the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A icon. Click on that. It'll open a window. Type your question there. That will come to all of the panelists, and we will answer as many questions as we can at the end of today's presentation. And finally, we invite you to join us on Twitter. We will be live tweeting throughout today's event using the hashtag GivingUSA2020 and our Twitter handle, which is @the Alford Group, both here in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. So we will be live tweeting, and we invite you to join the conversation there as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Brenda to walk us through the agenda and kick us off today.
Thank you, Lucinda. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for taking time out to join the Alfred Group on this webinar. Over the past 3 months, we all have witnessed philanthropy at its very best: responsive, engaged, and nimble, with over $10 billion contributed globally through May. Philanthropy is playing a very significant role in addressing the inequities being amplified by the pandemic, as well as in systems of oppression. The focus of many working in nearly every sector right now is understandably on doing whatever is necessary to ensure the survival of their organizations in the face of unprecedented challenges. But it is also important that we find time to look up and ahead, for that exactly is where we all are going. While none of us knows what the future will bring, we can start to identify key questions and possible scenarios. That way, we can work backwards to what needs to be done now to ensure we maximize the chances of ending up with the future that we want. It is our intention for you to leave today's webinar with some strategic takeaways that you can put to work right away in your organization. To that end, during our time together, we will be taking a brief look back to 2019 to understand some of the emergent trends that impacted philanthropy, and then taking a telescopic look into 2020 and probably beyond to guide our thinking as we plan for the future. We are fortunate to have with us a curated panel of leaders who will share their thoughts on the new era of philanthropy and how organizations can best position themselves to thrive in the next normal. There will be time for questions as Lucinda indicated, so please post them in the Q&A function. The Alfred Group is proud to be one of the longest term members of the Giving Institute and sponsors of the Giving USA report, which is researched and written by the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Well, it's time for the numbers and what they mean. I'm pleased to introduce Karen Rotko-Wynn, Executive Vice President with the Alford Group, who will take us through the Giving USA highlights. I know you will enjoy hearing from Karen, and I'll see you in a little bit.
Thank you, Brenda, and hello everyone out there in this virtual world that we're living in. It's great. I'm very excited to be sharing these Giving USA numbers with all of you today. I have to say that for the past 19 years as a consultant with the Alfred Group, and before that when I worked in the arts, I look forward to this data being released every year. And then I always find myself saying, I can't wait until next year. Well, in these challenging and volatile times, we do wonder how 2020 will turn out in our world of philanthropy. So you may ask, which we had this conversation indeed together, is why is this data from 2019 relevant and how can I use it? Well, I can tell you it is very relevant to you as leaders of nonprofit organizations. And here are 3 reasons. I'm going to give you 3 reasons. Number 1, it's important to understand data trends to know where you should focus your efforts. Number 2, it's important to understand where your organization fits into this data. And number 3, it's important for you to use this data as you navigate through this year and in your planning for future years. More than ever before, philanthropy is in the spotlight. An opportunity to bring the message about the role of philanthropy has played and is currently playing a major role in these challenging times. And we have seen significant growth. So I will start with an overview of what I will be covering today. First of all, I'm going to give you a brief overview about what is Giving USA. You're going to hear about the 2019 contributions by source and recipient type, the rates of change for giving over the last 2 years by source and recipients, the trends in total giving. Remember, Brenda said this data has been collected for 60 years. So we have a lot of data and a lot of trends over history, and also really focusing on the last 2 years and in the last 10 years. I want you to leave with an understanding about economic trends and how that impacts giving. You'll hear about trends in giving by source and trends in giving by recipient type. Actually, Giving USA is celebrating 65 years as of 2020, and it is the longest running, most comprehensive, and most authoritative report on charitable giving in the United States. It's important to note this is a big data project. This data is collected from 128 million households, 600,000 nonprofits, 80,000 US foundations, and businesses of all stages. So it's important to understand this data has the most robust information that we have at our fingertips. And as Brenda said, it's made possible by contributions by the Giving Institute member firms, foundations, and other donors. So here's the bottom line. This is the big news. And this was released yesterday, so you might have heard this number already, but this is incredible. We have reached, in 2019, almost $450 billion in philanthropy in the United States in 2019. This represents a 4.2% increase in current dollars over 2018, and in inflation-adjusted dollars, a 2.4% increase. What's really significant about this is we have seen 3 consecutive years now of high-level giving. So to put this into context, in 2017, 2018, and 2019, charitable giving crossed the $400 billion threshold. This was all pre-COVID, and it's important to understand where we were as we now find ourselves in this uncertain environment. This graph illustrates that the last 3 years, we actually achieved 400 billion, but you can see that over the last 10 years, this has grown by about $10 billion in giving. As we look at 40-year giving in total overall giving, what's really interesting about this slide is that it shows, again, that pinnacle that we are at now of almost 450 billion in 2019, which is an increase, by the way, of 18.21 billion in current dollars from 2018. And as I mentioned, a 10.4 billion in inflation adjusted dollars. The average year-to-year change in total giving between 1979 and 2019 was an increase of $10.16 billion, making the current dollar change in giving between 2018 and 2019 larger than the 40-year average. And I'm going to actually show you in a moment the next chart, which shows how giving trends change during recession years. And as you can see, when we went through the Great Recession in 2009, giving dropped slightly, but not nearly to the same extent as the stock market dropped. And I think it's also just to point out on this slide that in current dollars, you can see the dotted line goes from 43 billion in 1979 to 450 billion in 2019. But in inflation adjusted dollars, it is actually apples to apples to say we were at 151 billion only 10 years ago, 40 years ago, and now in 2019, we're at 450 billion. So it really shows that fantastic growth since 1979. Giving responds to economic indicators. The economy is the context, and the context matters in philanthropy. Let us start with talking about the stock market. The stock market grew 28.9% over 2018. The last quarter of the year was unfavorable. 2019 had a lot of speculation. There were talks of trade wars, trade policies, fear of recession. The good news was that we ended on a positive note, which meant that giving ended quite strong. Also, personal income grew 4.4% over 2018. And this compares with a 6.1% growth in disposable personal income between 2017 and 2018. Disposable personal income is tied to total overall household income, which is a key determinant on how much households give. Another indicator is that the gross domestic product grew 4.1% over 2018. It's really important for all of us to understand that charitable giving is influenced and was influenced by the context of 2019, and fundraisers must now respond to the current uncertain environment. Giving USA is an excellent resource to see how philanthropy has adapted to the current environment, and it's important to note that historically donors have responded to areas of need, and as we have seen recently, certainly in areas of crisis. So it's more important than ever to make your case for your organization, connect with your donors is more important than ever, and to know that technology is and will play an important role in navigating the new landscape. It's going to be important to understand how to utilize technology to take advantage of opportunities and be innovative in our approach with donors. 2020 giving will certainly be influenced by the economy, politics, the pandemic, and our social crisis that we're currently faced with. Fundraisers will need to adapt and respond to the needs of the current situation. Remember, keep your mission in the forefront and stay close to your donors. We'll say that over and over again as consultants and as our best advice to nonprofits, to keep your mission in the forefront and to stay close to your donors. This chart is actually one of my favorites. I have a couple of favorites, and I'll show you why in a moment. Because as we look at the total trends from 1979 to 2019, you can see again the gray bar is reflection of inflation-adjusted dollars. All right, the current dollars, if you were comparing today's dollars to what was $50 billion in 1979 to $450 billion in 2019, is the dotted line. What's interesting about this is that the green bar indicates the inflation-adjusted dollars during recession. So we're really looking at the bars because that's the apples to apples scenario. And as you can see that although we had recessions in these years where you see the green bar, the giving dropped only slightly compared to the stock market. One note about the Great Recession, which ended in 2009. For the most recent decade, from 2010 to 2019, the total growth in inflation-adjusted giving is 33%. We haven't seen that kind of steady growth since the late 90s. And I was in a situation during that time where I got to experience that wave and how exciting that was to be raising money during the late 90s when we went through that surge. And the surge that we've experienced in the last 10 years is significant and really important to understand. This next slide reflects what I mentioned in terms of charitable giving graphed next side by side with the S&P. So the green line is total giving in 2019 dollars, okay? Inflation adjusted in 2019 dollars. The dotted line shows the S&P in 2019 dollars. And as you can see, during the Great Recession, we had an amazing dip in the stock market, and yet giving, although it dipped slightly, did not drop to the same extent. This graph has been encouraging for us to be reflecting on over the last few months as we anticipate giving going up and down over this really incredible time we're facing. But we also are seeing that the stock market is continuing to hold steady, which is very interesting. We have a lot to understand here. The S&P grew 26.6% between 2018 and 2019, compared with the increase in current dollars of 29%. So this next slide shows total giving as a percentage of gross domestic product. Other economic factors related to how much donors give to charity includes the gross domestic product. Its GDP is the market value of all goods and services produced within a country's borders during a specific time period, and is one of the most important factors in measuring the status of a nation's economic health. The GDP increased by 2.3 in inflation-adjusted dollars between 2018 and 2019, compared to the GDP increasing by 2.7 between 2017 and 18. So total giving as a percentage of GDP in both 2018 and 2019 was 2.1%. And I have to say, every year I look at this graph and I like to imagine how much more giving would be if giving as a percentage of the GDP just rose by 1 percentage point. I keep waiting for that to happen. All right, this slide is truly my favorite slide for many, many reasons. My favorite chart. Collecting this data over time gives us some really unique insights. And we have seen some significant changes over time, just in the 20 years that I've been really looking at this information closely. First of all, it's important to note that in 2019, all giving sources are at either an all-time or second all-time high. The first thing that was striking to us when we saw these numbers come out for 2019 is that individual giving is now 69% of the pie. This is the first time it's dropped below 70%. For years, this was well over 80%. What makes this difference now is that foundations are expanding their footprint in philanthropy. Giving by foundations, which includes grants made by independent, community, and operating foundations, amounted to 17% of all gifts made in 2019. Corporations have remained steady at around 5% of overall giving, and bequests have increased in its share. Giving by bequest accounted for 10% of all gifts made in 2019. With regard to bequests, it's important to note that with the aging demographic in the United States, more individuals will be thinking about charitable contributions in their wills. And if you don't have a planned giving program, you should by all means start one now. What's important to note about this slide, and I encourage you to use this with your boards, within your organizations, is that if you take into account the outright giving by individuals of 69%, more than half of the foundation giving comes from individuals and families, and 10% from bequests, we're talking about around 88% of all charitable giving coming from individuals. So when do you want to use this slide? When someone in the organization says, I think we should focus all our effort on corporate giving. Granted, it's important to get your piece of the pie in corporate giving, but this is why we focus so much of our fundraising effort on individual fundraising and major gifts. This is just a quick snapshot that I just talked about in terms of the 2019 versus 2018 growth, that we were the biggest change in growth was in corporations by 13.4%. I'll talk about that in a moment. Second, giving by individuals up 4.7, giving by foundations 2.5, and then a slight change in current dollars in giving by bequests. I'm going to briefly go through these key areas to highlight some interesting points. As I mentioned, disposable personal income increased 4.3% in current dollars in 2019 from 2018, and compares with 6.1% growth in disposable income between 17 and 18. So it's important to note that that plays a factor in individual giving. Also, individual giving being at this all-time high of over $300 billion, it's important to note that very large mega gifts or gifts by individuals that require an adjustment to the ecometric estimate totaled $3.17 billion in 2019. What's interesting about that is that the total amount includes both itemized and non-itemized charitable contributions. Giving by foundations, also at a high of almost $76 billion, and this represents grant making by independent, community, and operating foundations. We saw an increase of 2.5% over 2018 to this estimate of almost $76 billion in 2019. Giving grew by all three types of foundations included in this estimate. Independent foundations increased by 2.2%, operating foundations increased by 1.3%, and giving by community foundations increased 5.6%. The estimates by Giving USA have indicated that 64% of giving by independent foundations each year is actually driven by family foundations. Again, people. Charitable giving by bequest is estimated to have stayed relatively flat, with a growth rate of 0.2% in current dollars from 18 to 19. And the total amount includes the estimated amount for bequests from estates from assets from 5 million and above all the way down to under $1 million. Estimates from estates of 5 million and above amounted to $25 billion. Estimated bequest giving from estates between $1 million and 5 amounted to $7 billion. And here's the thing, estimates from bequests from estates with assets below $1 million are estimated to be $11 billion. So it's not just the mega donors who are leaving significant bequests, it's estates below $1 million that are leaving over $11 billion. I'm going to quickly go through the sectors, giving by corporations increased as well. What's important to know about giving by corporations is generally half of the giving is in kind and the other half is actually given through corporate foundations or given by the foundations. So, and again, the GDP increase influences corporate giving. It is also influenced by disasters, and we had a lot of domestic disasters in 2019, and corporations stepped up during that, and that attributes to growth in that area. With regard to recipients, this is always exciting to look at as well. Another favorite chart, where did the dollars go? Well, for the longest time, 50% of all charitable giving was going to religion. Now the dollars to religion has not dropped, but the percentage has. And the reason for that is that there have been more, there's been more diverse giving to other pieces of the pie. So even though religion still remains at the highest percentage of giving at 128 billion, you can see education comes in second, human resources next, and then gifts to grant-making foundations at 12%. If you look at cumulative or over the 2-year period, we like to look at 2-year period because it gives you more of a picture of how the trends of these subsectors have remained steady. So for instance, arts, environment, and education have all seen 2 years of consecutive growth. And one of the factors that plays into that is that high net worth households place arts, environment, and education in their priority in giving. So it's also really exciting to look at the fact that the 2-year growth rate was positive for all 9 subsectors. But arts and culture, environment, and education had the really strong 2-year growth rates. So with that, I am going to just wrap up so that we can move back to Brenda with our panel. And I just want to say in conclusion that as you look at these statistics, ask yourself, what does this mean now? The good news is that we had really strong momentum coming into 2020. The billionaires are growing their wealth. Millionaires are staying wealthy. It's important to understand where you have been and let this data give you the context for your planning. In this light, your nonprofit can examine your own data to position how you will come out of this crisis. Number 1, focus on donor retention. Donor retention remains at about 45% overall. We need to improve that retention rate. Stay close to your donors, keep your mission front and center, and communicate with your constituents. One last slide on how to receive this information. As Lucinda said, we will send you a recap of some of the slides, but you can actually get a discount on the Giving USA book, which is about to come out. And to get a 30% discount, you can use the discount code Alfred and Giving USA. And you can, and as Lucinda said, we will be sending you some additional information. So back over to Brenda to bring us to the current day of the Giving USA and the new Age of Philanthropy with our panel. Brenda, over to you.
Thank you, Karen, so much for bringing us such a great snapshot of 2019. Well, we came into 2020 with high hopes of even stronger growth. Little did we know what was about to unfold. Now let's look ahead. We have a dynamic panel who will be bringing perspective and relevant experience to further inform how the philanthropic marketplace and donors are responding to the changing landscape. I'd like to start by introducing our panel, Laura Coye. Laura joined William Blair in 2016 to elevate the financial services firm's philanthropic culture and create opportunities to engage employees and clients in strategic philanthropy. Laura works as a trusted partner with families focused on high impact philanthropy. She also leads William Blair's Foundation, which is aimed at inspiring the next generation of philanthropists through its employee-centered matching and global signature grants program. She is former board chair emeritus of the Association of Corporate Citizenship Professionals and serves on the leadership committee of the Illinois Holocaust Museum. Thank you, Laura, for joining us today. Marguerite Griffin is a senior vice president at Northern Trust. As director of Philanthropic Advisory Service, Marguerite is responsible for the delivery and growth of Northern Trust philanthropic advisory services to wealth management clients. She is a sought-after speaker in the areas of impact investing, strategic philanthropy, board development, managing private foundations, and family legacy philanthropy. She is an active volunteer advisor and board member with many charitable and cultural institutions, including the Art Institute, Literacy Chicago, the Celebrant Institute, Chicago Foundation for Women, the Chicago Community Trust, and many others. Thank you, Marguerite, for being on the panel today. Steve Maisland is president and CEO of the Greater Houston Community Foundation, and along with his dynamic team, is dedicated to partnering with their donors to create a lasting impact on the quality of life in the Houston region. Steve is a frequent speaker on charitable planning, donor advised funds, disaster recovery efforts, and the power of the Community Foundation platform to grow philanthropic impact. Steve came to Greater Houston Community Foundation in 2001 after 18 years as an estate planning advisor to high net worth families. Beth McCall is president and CEO of Washington Women's Foundation, one of the earliest and oldest models of women empowered philanthropy rooted in community. It was founded in 1995. This organization funds organizations committed to advancing equity and reflective of the communities that they serve. Since its inception, the foundation and its members have influenced transformation in communities across Washington state by collectively granting over $19 million. She currently chairs the boards of YWCA USA and Northwest Wine Benefit Foundation and serves on the board of directors of the Performing Arts Center, Eastside in Bellevue, Washington. Thank you, panel, for being with us this afternoon. Well, we all had great expectations for 2020. Based on the momentum and the that the sector anticipated coming into this year, and given the current operating environment, what surprised or concerned you the most about the 2019 data? Laura, let's start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Brenda. I think being that William Blair is a global financial services firm, we recognize the impact of the strong economic headwinds coming into 2019. What I was really surprised and pleasantly surprised about was just the donor appetite for the participation versus the preservation of capital acquired. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in some of the trends we're seeing in philanthropists wanting to see change earlier and putting their philanthropy to work now. I think that's because of some of the things that were discussed, having specific calls for action. in areas of need from nonprofits. We're going to talk a little bit about COVID, of course, and racial equity, but we're seeing those trends in education and environment, and now human rights. So, donors are taking risks versus seeking returns. And for years, we were really focused on outcome metrics and measurement. But I think what's been interesting with COVID is looking at the rapid rate of collaboration and investment in PPE, therapeutics, testing, and the engagement of public-private partnerships. And what was mentioned, the mega giving and the moonshot philanthropy is on the rise, with philanthropists using a variety of vehicles. So I do think we're going to see some shifts, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, with less bifurcation of individuals versus corporations, for instance. But philanthropists are using LLCs, donor advised funds, and foundations, and you're going to continue to see, I think, both the trend of mega giving and multiple vehicle philanthropy continue to evolve. So Brenda, I think that my only concern coming into this year is how we will maintain this lift. And I think we're going to continue to see a lift in philanthropy in 2020. I'm very optimistic about that, but I think my biggest concern is how we're all going to collaborate to maintain that lift, because the issues we're facing today are not episodic issues, and philanthropy is going to need to sustain in the long term to really make a difference.
That's great, 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 great. Steve, what concerned or surprised you?
On the concern side, just building on what Laura was just saying, it concerns me just about every year to see the increasing burden on our sector, particularly as government is underfunded and what have you, and yet we just can't seem to unmoor ourselves from that 2% plus or minus of GDP. And Karen's comment earlier, if we could just move that up 50%, it would be obviously a game changer. And so maybe this is the opportunity where we can sustain some of what we've seen with donors stepping up this year. I also think, we're talking a lot within the Community Foundation in Houston as we've done more partnering with the public sector. If that's not going to be an opportunity for us to drive more impact with kind of aligned funding rather than, if you will, captured funding that goes through us, it doesn't matter, it's all impact. So we're spending some time thinking about that. The surprise, I think a few of us would notice the decline in international giving after a couple of years of growth. I'm going to be intrigued to see where that goes 2, 3, 5 years out, because there's more pain locally now, economically, racially, and otherwise. But the pandemic also showed us how interconnected the world is now.
That's
and so
right.
I'm not quite sure where donors are going to think about that going forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Marguerite?
Yes, my impressions are very much like Laura and Steve. Some of the things that they pointed out, I'll just like to add to it. And it's more, not a concern, but more of a speculation. And that is that estate giving has been relatively flat over the last several years. And I do believe that that's because there are more clients who are wanting to make a difference during their lifetime. So they're not waiting until death to make a gift. They're not making complimentary gifts. So I would imagine that that is a trend that we'll continue to see, that estate giving will remain flat as donors try to use their resources now so that they can really make a difference.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation as we think about estate giving and the giving pledge, the number of philanthropists who have committed to giving during their lifetime. So it's really interesting to see where that's going to go. Beth, what surprised or concerned you from the 2019 data?
I was pleasantly surprised to see the uptick, because when I looked at the IRS data from 2018, after the 2017 Tax Cuts and Job Act, Americans itemized $54 billion less in charitable deductions in 2018. So you see some dip, but then I was glad to see some recovery in 2019. So I'm hopeful that that trend will continue and not just be spurred by the pandemic. But it makes me wonder, are individuals continuing to give without a tax break, which would be fabulous? Or are we seeing those larger donors actually having an outsized influence on the data as well? So I would really love to get really more disaggregated data to see how are smaller, mid-sized, and larger donors all behaving. I also am concerned to still see arts, culture, and humanities at 5%, and I just know in our community here in Seattle, like what has happened, the devastation to our arts and cultural institutions in the wake of the pandemic, and closure, meaning they've completely lost all their earned revenue. Can philanthropy really step up to save some of these important institutions? And that's to be seen. So that concerns me.
Thank you. Well, as funders and professional philanthropic advisors, let's talk a little bit now about how your clients or your organization is approaching philanthropy differently in this environment. Initially, let's talk about what are some of the pivots that you've seen given COVID, urgent needs, and then now in response to the call for equity. Marguerite?
Yes.
What are you seeing?
So I refer to it as a pivot from established missions or strategic goals, but it's really a pause, I think. I can't say that our clients will leave those causes and those issues that are most important to them, but they are trying to shore up resources to address basic human needs, to provide resources for vulnerable populations, and also to respond to the calls for social justice and racial equity. And what it's doing is it's causing them to think differently about where they've placed resources in the past, what would be sustainable going forward. And then there's a big push to learn and educate themselves about those organizations that they are going to be giving to, especially in the area of racial equity. Mm-hmm. And we are finding that we have to educate them. Some of the nonprofit organizations are not traditional 501c3s. They use fiscal sponsors. And so just explaining how they can make a difference, giving to organizations that might not look like the organizations that they're used to, but they're nonetheless doing the work on the front line, just in time, and addressing those issues that are important. Many of our clients are pushing forward their gifts that they had planned for the fall. They're bringing those forward. And they're also looking for ways to join other funders, because they recognize that bringing assets together, bringing resources together is how they can most make a difference. And then finally, I would say we're seeing some changes in our clients who have private foundations or donor advised funds. Many of them are using their donor advised funds as pass-throughs anyway, but we're finding that they're more willing to increase the amounts that are distributed from those funds. And specifically for private foundations, they are giving more than the 5% that's required. So those are some of the things that we're seeing. Also, finally, I would just say that those clients who do have private foundations are looking for ways that they can use the 95%, so what's in their portfolio, to make a difference as well. So they're thinking about not just program related investments, but what can they do with their cash? How can they deploy their cash? How can they think about the investments in their portfolios as doing good as well as helping to grow the portfolios?
Wow, thank you. Beth, what are you seeing, and what shifts have your organization made?
Our organization changed our grant-making criteria 2 years ago to be focused on equity, specifically race and gender identity equity. And so I feel like we haven't institutionally made a lot of changes in response, although we have dipped into our own quasi-endowment. So we're looking at all of our cash reserves and not holding on to it for a future rainy day. It's how much money can we deploy as quickly as possible. We're a collective of over 400 individual women philanthropists, and what I'm seeing among them, and we've surveyed them to see how their behaviors are changing, is that they're leaning really into organizations with which they've had long-term established relationships and giving more. We're seeing them accelerating pledge payments. So perhaps they had made a 5 or 3 year pledge to an organization. They're paying it all at once. They are connecting with organizations to which they've made capital campaign pledges to ask if those monies need to be repurposed for general operations. And so I see a lot of relationship building, a lot of conversations about how can we best support you in this time of crisis. At the YWCA USA, we have a very large quasi endowment that we ended up taking a line of credit against it so that we could make money available to local associations throughout the country. So I think, to Marguerite's point, like looking creatively at every single part of your portfolio to figure out how you can deploy it most effectively. And I am seeing too now, especially in response to what's been going on in our community, a lot of money moving into C4, 501c4 organizations, into movements that are fiscally sponsored. And so I think it's going to be, interesting to see, can we track that data as well? Because I have a lot of women who are giving C3, C4, and now really money to PACs. They're really focused on campaign contributions as well. So really looking at which are all the ways that we leverage change in our communities and deploying assets in all those places.
Great. Steve, on the community foundation front, I know that you were one of the early community foundations out there in terms of COVID response.
Absolutely. So we're basically deeply engaged with 3 specific efforts. You probably know that there are community-wide funds around the country led either by community foundations or our colleagues at United Way or jointly. And so for the first time ever, we're co-administering a fund with our United Way, which I would say is very appealing to funders. It's an easy vehicle that they get, that they can aggregate their funds. And so that's been underway. We've deployed about 2/3 of the funds already, and that's going really well. And then we are administering a fund for the first time ever on behalf of our county. And that's a new model, and it's been intriguing, a very heavy use of data, working with a local consulting firm to identify the truly most vulnerable and laying data sets on top of each other, looking at geographies and other social vulnerabilities and income and on and on. And then the grants are being distributed via nonprofit partners using direct cash distributions, gift cards, direct deposit, et cetera, rather than bill pay. And we have an academic institution doing an evaluation after the fact on that. And I think we've seen more of that in the philanthropic sector, and I think that's going to be interesting. And then we also adopted an idea that came out of Dallas, utilizing unemployed restaurant workers to help with food distribution, because like so many other places, food insecurity has been a very significant issue in Houston. So that's a great way to get income to these folks and help the food bank leverage their resources. So that's worked very well. In terms of the racial equity side of things, we're responding, as we always do, to donor interest in providing resources, which has been led by next-gen donors so far, learning more about racial justice, and particularly around educating ourselves around Black-led philanthropic organizations, especially at the neighborhood level. We know we have a decent amount of knowledge because of the disaster relief work, but there's a lot of learning to do for us and our donors, and I see that as an increasing path going forward. And then building on what some of the other panelists have said, we're seeing an increasing use, and this happened really before, but it's accelerating around multiple entities and advocacy and C4 work and the like, and I also expect that will continue as well.
It's going to be really interesting around the C4s and see the proliferation and what's going to happen. Laura, on the corporate front.
Yeah, I mean, very, very similar. I mean, we always ask ourselves, what is the purpose of our capital, right? So whether that's applying an ESG lens under the corpus of our foundation, really utilizing the foundation in ways that we haven't before. But it's interesting, like you said, Brenda, our mission is to inspire the next generation of philanthropists. While I applaud the Fortune 100 companies who have made a total combined commitment of $1.6 billion to eradicate racial wealth inequity and racial inequity at large, we really believe that our people have the decision-making and the power to make a difference as well. So we're seeing a huge uptick in employee matching. We launched a COVID 1-to-1 match. We just launched a social and racial equity 3-to-1 match to help and support our employees who want to make a difference and let them guide the giving versus the few corporate executives making the decisions. So we have a goal of achieving at least a 50% participation rate in our matching programs this year, and I think we'll achieve that. So, you know, that a little bit of a shift of a culture of fundraising versus just grant making, and you know, with everyone on this panel can attest to, whether that be the giving circles or the corporate cultures or the philanthropists. I'm really excited about that shift, and I hope it really does become a trend, that whether that be through collaboration or through matching programs, or, I mean, we've had people lead challenge grants for nonprofits during COVID that have yielded more than $200,000 on Giving Tuesday to help out with fundraising. So that culture of fundraising versus grant making is a trend that we are proud to be on the front end of, and I would like to see continue.
No, Laura, something that was interesting early on when you and I spoke, you made note of the fact that William Blair was doing more than giving money. In addition to giving money, we were looking for other ways to support organizations early on. And I looked at it as really expanding the definition of philanthropy. Could you just touch on that? Because I think that's a very interesting trend as we kind of think about what are we going to see in the future in this new era. What are the other ways that you see corporations supporting in addition to the dollars?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, if you look at what we're doing good with what we're good at doing, helping entrepreneurs, helping small businesses recover, you know, we're kind of taking a 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 approach. So the 1.0 is the rapid and immediate response. The 2.0 is the longer term need. So the giving pledge that you mentioned, multi-year giving, really doubling down on our core grantees. And the 3.0 is looking at how that capital can be even further catalyzed, and whether that's you know, doing financial literacy for first line responders or those in the healthcare industry, or setting up donor advised funds for minorities who should be investing themselves in their own communities. We're really looking at philanthropy as a tool versus just a check. And I think you're going to see more of that because companies want their people to apply their expertise. And so again, whether you're insurance or financial services or you know, a commercial business, and we saw great responses on the commercial side during COVID, you know, transitioning construction companies into building hospitals. You're going to see more of that as companies want to leverage their entire pool of capital, human and financial, to make a difference.
That's terrific. Thank you. Well, you know, we talked about donor retention, and we know that many organizations were the beneficiary of some pretty large first-time gifts from donor advised funds, from family foundations, high net worth individuals. Well, you know, do we see those gifts as one and done? I think Marguerite touched on it before, but do we think that these gifts are one and done? Or do you see opportunities for organizations to retain these donors? And if so, how should organizations best position themselves? Steve, I'd like you to kick us off with, what do we do to keep these donors giving?
What we saw with our donors, and they were very intentional and pretty clear about it, is that they understood early on that the nonprofit sector was in a world of hurt. And they looked at the organizations about which they are passionate, and you know, that obviously work in the areas that they care about. And they did prioritization, and they stepped up in a very significant way to help sustain certain of those organizations who were operating really effectively. But they also acknowledged early on they could not save all of the organizations they had supported historically. And so they moved away from some of the organizations where they saw perceived poor leadership, a weak business model, or it just wasn't in the heart of their passion of where they wanted to center their philanthropic work, recognizing that those organizations might not survive. And I suspect, so they narrowed their focus, and I suspect that that increased level of giving will sustain for at least some period of time. Our experience, not only now, but in the past, is when you go through difficult economic times, the ROI, the return on philanthropic investment, is increasingly important. And so demonstrating ROI, or we see it done well by nonprofit organizations is a combination of stories and data. The stories that make the work really human, and the data that speaks to stewardship, especially for strategic donors, and that in particular are the next gen donors. And I would just say in conclusion, we launched a community indicators project in partnership with a local academic institution, the Kinder Institute at Rice University, about a year ago. And that data is moving front and center to a lot of the philanthropic work, particularly because it paints so clearly the racial inequities in our community. And I suspect that we'll see more and more of that kind of focus out of our donors over time.
Okay, Marguerite, what are your thoughts on this front?
Yes, I don't see these gifts as being necessarily one and done, but for high net worth individuals, the clients that we work with, I do see that there is a concern about being out there and being seen as supporting a cause that might be very different from their mission or what their family philanthropy, their family foundations stand for. So we see a number of our clients who are interested in making anonymous gifts. And we also saw one client, one nonprofit actually offer up that possibility that, by the way, you could make this gift anonymously. And the donor liked that idea and gave the organization twice as much as he was planning to give. So we find that individuals will give anonymously for a number of reasons, for privacy reasons, because it's their religious beliefs, because they're not really interested in seeing their name in lights. But now we're also seeing that some of our clients might be a bit hesitant to say, we're going to be in the health and human services field for the long term. They don't want to say that, but I also don't think that they're going to pull away. And I have to say that it is, in many cases, it's the younger family members that are holding the clients who have some type of permanent giving vehicle or semi-permanent giving vehicle. It's the younger family members who want to be engaged, and they're the ones that have been focused and wanted there to be a focus on social justice issues in the first place. So now that there is this opportunity, I don't think that they're going to move away from that and go back to other types of giving, even though that giving is equally as important. I must say that the shifts and the pivots that we have are so necessary right now, but our philanthropic institutions will continue to need our support. My hope is that because there are new family members, new individuals who are being engaged, that by increasing the number of individuals who have wealth, who are interested in philanthropy and see it as a moral imperative, see it as something that is essential to how they define themselves as individuals and families, that those additional voices are going to make sure that these are not one and done gifts.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear that about the next generation. We certainly hear that a lot when we interview our more traditional philanthropists, where they have a great desire to get their next generation involved in philanthropy. So I'm very hopeful that the pie will continue to grow, because we now have these new players having an increased voice in directing dollars from and through their family foundations and donor advised funds. You know, as we think about growth opportunities, we've talked about, you know, the next generation. We've talked about multi-year funding from corporations. I'm interested in hearing, you know, from Beth, you know, when we think about, you know, where are there some growth opportunities for nonprofits? Where should nonprofits be looking for support that they have not in the past? So again, we talk about the new era. That means we have to look in different places. So Beth, share your thoughts on where do you see some growth opportunities?
Well, and I don't know that it's necessarily new. I think it harkens back to what we heard from Karen in the presentation, the importance of relationships and the importance of individual giving. Giving collectives like the Washington Women's Foundation have been growing exponentially over the last few years. So we show up as an institutional funder, but it's really individuals making the decisions. In the Pacific Northwest, 44% of all the institutional grant making that happens is through family foundations. So again, those personal relationships. Yeah. And I think the donor advised funds, we've already talked about them, but I've read that Fidelity Charitable reported that through May 5th of this year, they've seen an 18% increase in the giving from DAFs as compared to this time last year. I'm sure a lot of that is in response to the times, but there is a tremendous amount of wealth still locked up in DAFs. If folks on the call haven't heard of the Half My DAF Challenge, David and Jennifer Risher, who lived in the Seattle area while he worked for Amazon and Microsoft for a while, live now in California. And they have put together a $1.4 million matching fund. They are encouraging other individuals to make contributions from their donor advised funds. And if you commit and pledge to give half of the money in your donor advised fund away by September 30th of this year, then you can nominate a nonprofit organization to be eligible for that $1.4 million matching pledge pool. So I think there's some exciting, interesting, creative ways that fellow philanthropists are looking to each other. So I would encourage nonprofits to continue building those relationships and inviting philanthropists to come on in partnership to encourage their peers to really step up their giving, be willing to take some risks. And so I think it's really all about building relationships and leveraging those relationships.
Great. Laura, where are you seeing some new opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, just in compounding capital. So, build the strategies for challenge grants and get people to collaborate. That they've been hugely successful. They've always worked really well, but I think now is a huge time to really look at how challenge grants can double the impact of philanthropic dollars. It's attractive. The second area I would say teeters a little bit on next gen, but we've always talked about time, talent, and treasure, and now we've added testimony as the fourth T. Take a look at who those advocates out there in the community, because those are going to be your next generation fundraisers and philanthropists. And to dovetail that a little bit, the next gen, they are so energized. And I just echo what everyone has said. Most of our client related work right now is educating and engaging the G3s, the G4s of philanthropic families, and they are charged up to make a difference. So, they might not hold the majority of the wealth yet, but if they are on the boards of those foundations and they're active in their communities, they are your decision makers of the future, and they will invest with you. And then I guess just the last area for companies is, William Blair actually allocates a little over 10% of our philanthropy to our business resource groups. So if you are looking to seek corporate philanthropic capital, of course you have professionals within those firms that oversee that, but look to their ERGs and their business resource groups as partners as well, particularly in the pursuits looking at equity and engagement in the community. So those are just four areas that we're seeing and would recommend really looking at the future.
I'm really encouraged to hear the interest in advocacy. That's an area that many organizations are challenged with finding dollars for. So to know that this is opening up new opportunities in that realm, I think is so important and will continue to advance the mission of organizations who are really on the front line of changing policies and systems. So I'm really happy to hear that. We've been talking a lot about, the look ahead and all the great things that, in terms of opportunities. We can't end our conversation with the panel without taking a little bit of a step back and thinking through, what do we see as the future? I mean, do we anticipate shifts where the pace of giving is going to slow down? I've heard the word pause. So are we at a pause moment at this time as funders and donors are evaluating kind of where they want to make their impact and who else are they going to add or who are they not going to continue to fund? So share your thoughts. What should we be thinking, as we anticipate the rest of the year in terms of donor behavior and helping nonprofits really figure out how to even plan as we think about what's ahead? Steve?
The first thing I would say is when we look at the track record of the donors at the Community Foundation, and we go back through tough economic times, it's amazing how stable the giving is from entrepreneurs. They tend to be optimistic and really comfortable that they're going to continue to make money and what have you. So one thing I would say is to focus on your entrepreneurs, which kind of goes along with making sure, and this is always a good idea, obviously, but particularly now, doing kind of a deep dive on your giving base and particularly your larger supporters, because depending on their circumstance, some of them are going to emerge from this very quickly, may already have in terms of purely economically I'm talking about, whereas others may not. And, you know, it's sometimes a surprise to our staff, but if someone's very wealthy and they go through a really traumatic time economically and their net worth drops by half, it doesn't matter how wealthy they are, they're uncomfortable for a while in terms of giving. And so understanding your donors and relationships are important, but knowing who to go ask for sooner rather than later. You know, I think the current focus on social justice, hopefully, is going to endure for years. So settling in on that, embedding it in our organizations, I think is going to be critical. And kind of looking at challenges going forward. There's already, even before all this, a real focus on high net worth giving and whether that, you know, the positive aspects, but also the negative of that. And you see that in giving going up, but the number of donors not with the most recent tax law. And so I think nonprofits are increasingly in a situation where we're going to be a bridge between those high net worth donors and the community. And I think that represents both opportunity and risk to us.
Yeah, I would agree. Laura?
Yeah, I don't know that it's going to be a pause other than, you know, what fundraising tools are nonprofits looking at. So the front half of the year, you know, it was awesome. A lot of events that got canceled have far exceeded their fundraising goals during virtual events. People are giving Tuesday when they moved it to May 5th. I was skeptical. It was, you know, Cinco de Mayo. Who knows, right? But like people were giving, and they were giving cash, and they're giving now. But I'd like to unpack, and I'd like to see nonprofits really unpack the CARES Act and plan giving a little bit more, that dip that Marguerite talked about. There's more there for nonprofits to look at. And once we've kind of resolved the pivot of sustaining the momentum that's created, I think I think looking at planned giving, complex giving is going to be very important, looking at the long term. So I don't know that that's going to be a pause, but I think there needs to be a shift in fundraising strategies to access additional pools of capital. And there's some good stuff in the CARES Act that I just don't think nonprofits have had the opportunity to fully explore. So just a minor example, but we just did a grant to a nonprofit to help them start a planned giving program because the funders that they had, oh my gosh, we looked at who their donors were. They were prime for launching a planned giving program, and they just needed some capacity building grants to help them actually launch that program. So I think it's not necessarily a pause, but perhaps a little bit of a pivot in looking at what type of philanthropic capital nonprofits are trying to unleash in the second half of the year.
Yeah, you know, I do want to make a comment about virtual events, because I think that you know, there's a perception that organizations are experiencing a one-to-one return on those events. Our numbers are showing, as we kind of track what's happening with our clients, they're yielding somewhere between 70 to 75% of what they would have yielded if they had done an actual live event. So for many nonprofits, they are still dealing with some gaps, and I know many of them are trying to factor that into their thinking this summer, and certainly as they go into their year-end giving programs. Marguerite, what are you seeing in terms of, will it slow down? What are challenges as we look ahead?
Yes, I believe that we are in a time where there's a true need for speed. We need to get the dollars where they are most needed at this time. We need to be responsive to what is important in this country to all of its citizens. But I also think that we have a need to scale. And something that Laura said about capacity building, we're finding that many of our clients really are looking to not just the end of the year, but next year and the year after that, how can they help these organizations that are doing really good work? How can they help them survive? And they're more interested in shoring up resources to help them build and to scale and to leverage the resources and the networks that they have. So I think this is the time to actually, when you engage with your donors, talking about what you need today, but also engage in a conversation about capacity building and your need or the organization's need to scale and to build its infrastructure, because that's what's really going to lead us to the sustainability that many of these really intractable issues are going to require from everyone, from the donors and also the nonprofit organizations.
Great, thank you. Beth?
I think what concerns me the most is that we're going to go back to old patterns of philanthropy, where you see Native American communities receiving less than 1% of institutional philanthropy. And so one of the things that we noticed here in Seattle was the rush into the pandemic response, and we actually held back and waited to see where the gaps appeared. And of course, they were there. And so I think it's that, being patient to see where those gaps are, to reach in and help address those gaps. I just am very concerned that we are not going to be funding the organizations that are on the front lines, on the grounds, doing the real transformative work that needs to be done in communities, because we haven't historically funded them. Not me as an individual philanthropist, not us as a institutional funder. And so I hope that we are going to change some of our past patterns because they weren't working. There was a question about, groups like mine, because I guess I'm probably the only person on the call that's, well, no, that's not true. Steve is too. Like, we're giving money away and we're busy trying to attract new donors and supporters to the work that we're doing. And what we found as Washington Women's Foundation is, we try to stay relevant. And that's why, we were talking about race and gender equity several years ago, moved boldly into that space and provide a lot of educational offerings around that. So over 50 educational programs a year. So I think there's a lot of hunger among philanthropists for as much education as possible. And I think that this is an opportune time for nonprofits, back to Steve's earlier point about, it's the stories and the data.
Data, yeah.
But I also want to caution everyone, sometimes we don't have time for the data. It's urgent. So Washington Women's Foundation, we completely eliminated all of our reporting requirements this year because that was just another step that's unneeded when everything's on fire. So I think, yes, and being, as philanthropists, being understanding of where the sector is and really showing up with our money, showing up with trust, really leaning into trust-based philanthropy, and just getting out of your way. Nonprofits, I promise you, I'm going to get out of your way. That's my pledge for 2020 and beyond. I'm just going to get out of your way. And so I think, all of us who can, take that step back and say, we just need the relationships. We don't need the reports so much right now. So I hope that trend continues on, and I hope it's helpful to the nonprofit sector.
I love the concept of this trust-based philanthropy. We should all write a book about what that looks like. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to turn to our questions and answers. And I want to thank you, panelists, for this time that we've had together. We have quite a few questions in our question box, and I'm going to turn over to Sharon Tiknis, our Executive Vice President, who's going to then moderate this portion of our time together. Sharon?
Thank you, and thank you all for the great questions you've been posing. Laura, let me start off with you around corporate philanthropy. One question is, what nonprofits are best suited to partner with corporations now?
That's a great question. I think it's, a lot of corporations have focus areas, and I think researching what those focus areas are is good. I think organizations that were financially strong before COVID were looking obviously to make investments based upon, you know, that data that Beth was talking about. And I think nonprofits that have a very strong sense of vision. You know, we have a matrix of how we evaluate nonprofits that include the fiduciary, the impact and whatnot, but we're more and more looking at nonprofits and their vision for tomorrow and how they need philanthropy to help them accomplish their goals. So I think it's a bit of a combination of what the right fit is, as well as what the mission is of the organization.
Thank you, Laura. Beth and Steve, what can you share with us about what has changed in terms of giving from donor advised funds? And I think coupled with that, is there a hyper local focus that is emerging in giving? Beth?
I would say for our individual donors who are making shifts in where they give, it has been hyper-local. Like the ones that have never given around food insecurity, that just jumped immediately as an area where, and it was hyper-local. And it was, again, that stepping back, even with our fabulous community foundation that funded a lot in that space, there were still small communities outside of the Seattle boundaries that still are, you know, they're the people who work in the restaurants in Seattle, that work in the hotels in Seattle, that work in retail and the gig economy, but they actually live in Tukwila, Washington, and the Tukwila Food Pantry was not part of that COVID response. And so it was really, I think, hyper-local, but also really sensitive to, again, where are those gaps and which communities are hurting the most and don't have institutional philanthropy ready to react and support them. So I think that was a big shift that we saw here.
Thanks. Steve, what shifts are you seeing, and also maybe what context do you have about increased giving from donor advised funds?
Yeah, there's been an upswing in giving from donor advised funds, I think, kind of across the platform. Community foundations have been reporting that all over the country. I think someone referenced earlier Fidelity. I think all of those funds as well, the commercial funds, have seen a big uptick. And generally speaking, the payout rate is already quite high. It's, you know, probably averages in excess of 20% if you put all that together. So it's gone up even from there. We've seen also a move towards more local funding. How long that will sustain, I think, is a little bit hard to say. We've seen some pretty significant gifts. I think it was Marguerite who talked about anonymous giving. We've seen some of that where folks wanted to step up, and sometimes it was because it didn't fit their strategic focus. Sometimes it was because they were making very large gifts, and they're very humble and religious people who didn't want that kind of limelight. It's not part of their philanthropy. So we've seen that as well. But I think you've seen where donor advised funds, the pass-through funds, can be really flexible, and people have taken advantage of that.
Right, great. A great question about I think actually, Laura, you mentioned the CARES Act and how that $1 trillion of investment in the economy might impact giving. There's a $300 deductible that individuals can claim. Any perspective on how the CARES Act, maybe even negatively, could impact giving, with the sense that there's more funds being made available for urgent needs?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the pushback on the 300 was is that enough? It's actually for giving next year, so I think there was a little bit of stimulus there. You know, I think that donors should really be thinking about. We actually saw a little bit more participation when people got their stimulus checks. Like as you mentioned, where smaller donations made by individuals who hadn't yet been philanthropic, who utilized that capital for philanthropy. You know, one of the stipulations in that CARES Act was those donations would not be made to donor advised funds because they wanted the incentive to be placed into that immediate need for speed right now. So, you know, I think if anything, it is there to incent, and the right intentionality was around it. I don't think it'll stall philanthropy, but I think it'll take a little bit more time for people to really understand and even just beyond what was in there philanthropically, how to leverage assets for philanthropic purpose through the CARES Act legislation. We've got some resources I'm happy to share from William Blair. I'm sure Northern Trust does as well, to help unpack that a little bit for nonprofits in particular to communicate those stipulations for their grantees.
Any other perspective on that? I'll move on to another observation. Just this last week, there was a fantastic announcement of $1.7 billion being jointly put together by the MacArthur Foundation, Mellon, Ford, Kellogg, and Doris Duke Foundations. And people are curious about your perspective on what the impact of that will be. You know, those funds, as I've read in the reports, are to deepen the resiliency of key organizations that are advancing the fight against inequality and injustice. So, Marguerite, would you like to offer your perspective when you read that and as you've thought about it?
Thank you. Yes, I was thrilled to see that news. And, you know, I like to take us back a few years to when Warren Buffett decided that he was going to not start his own foundation, but he was going to give to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I think that that created a pathway and a model for funders to think about how they can make the biggest difference. And sometimes doing it on your own might not be the best way. So these collaborations, I see them continuing. It makes so much sense. And these are organizations that already have really good infrastructures coming together. So pooling the resources, that's really what we have here. And when these funders can come together on issues that we're facing right now, I just see more of that in the future. And it will be a model and a guide for more modest funders, you know, not at the size of the Ford Foundation or MacArthur, but more modest funders are also taking, are looking at that and will be taking the lead to do more collaboration.
Any others like to comment on this?
I just would like to say, I feel like it's a silver lining to all of this, that this is one area where philanthropy is showing up well, moving quickly to collaborate. I mean, it's something we've been doing at Washington Women's Foundation for 25 years. So we know we're better when we go it together and can leverage our resources. But again, what I've noticed with some of these collaborations is, you know, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of relationship building, and it takes noticing who is and who isn't at the table. Mm-hmm. And so there will continue to be those cracks and those gaps if you don't have all the right community voices at the table. So I'm super excited. I'm glad to see it happening, and I'm curious.
Right. Yeah, there were some questions about you know, what we know about the state of individual giving, and a research conducted by the Lilly School a few years ago, it was reported that the share of household giving, the number of households giving, was declined by 13% between 2000 and 2016. So over that 16-year period, 13,000 households stopped giving or gave less. And much of that was attributed to a decline in trust in nonprofit organizations. And a lot of the reporting today is that perhaps this surge of giving, particularly in the last 3 months, has been related to a rebuilding of trust and faith in nonprofit organizations to deliver much needed services and to show that they are solutions oriented and able to have tremendous impact. Any comments on shifts in individual giving beyond what we've already shared? Another question is, you know, what impact do you imagine the national and state elections will have on giving? I open it to any of you. Laura, Beth, okay.
I was going to say, I wondered about that myself, because I definitely saw more women within our network giving politically in 2016. But we didn't notice that it reduced their philanthropic giving. It was an and. Yes, and I'm going to give more to political candidates, I'm going to give to campaigns. And so that was where we saw people really add to the different ways that they give, and brought more money, new money into it. So I'm hopeful, because I mean, that's the thing. We're gearing up into a time where there's a lot of competition for philanthropic dollars with the 2020 elections. But so far, we don't see it impacting.
Well, there's other questions that we answered during the session, and we will certainly share answers to other questions. But Brenda, I know you have a final question.
Hello again, everybody. I'm trying to get off. I'm just going to go ahead and ask my question here. My final question is, in our few minutes left. So as we kind of think about everything that we've heard today, and if there's any one thing as we think about our lightning round, in just a few words, tell us what is the one thing nonprofits should keep top of mind as they move into the next normal. Just one thing as a part of our wrap up. Steve?
I would go back to, I think it's been mentioned 2 or 3 times on both sides, the funder side and the nonprofit side, and that's collaboration. I think funders increasingly want to see that. We're talking about addressing, large systemic problems. Rarely can one institution really address that. And so coming together, you are able to, as a nonprofit, paint a much more comprehensive approach to funders, or a collaboration of funders on that side. And so I think for us, for all of us today, taking the lead in helping our organizations have that mindset and kind of dream together about it and begin to build stronger alliances with our colleagues would be particularly effective.
Fantastic, thank you. Marguerite?
One thing I would say, top of mind, relationship building. Know who your donor is and understand that you might have had a relationship with one family member in particular, but ask them, with whom are they making their charitable decisions, and find ways to engage entire family units. Because as we mentioned, sometimes it's the next generation, the younger family members, who may not necessarily be in complete control over those assets, but they will be the decision makers, and they will have control over those assets in the future. So continue to deepen the relationships you have with your existing donors, and then find ways to engage with the larger family unit that's involved in philanthropy.
Great. Beth?
I was going to say, and don't be afraid to make the ask. I mean, I've had several calls and conversations. I'm like, I know you want to ask me for money. Just ask me for money. And it's vulnerable, right? But I think that's what, I just appreciate the organizations that I can have a really open conversation. And I understand that you don't have all the answers now. I mean, we are responding to things that we never imagined when we put together budgets a year or 18 months ago. And so I think, we talk a lot about that at Washington Women's Foundation, and just just tell me what you need. I want to know, and I might not be able to write you the check now, but if you don't ask me, I don't know. So go for it. Go for it.
Yeah, and I have found that foundation leaders are more than happy to help lead to other opportunities and make introductions as a way to be helpful. So ask. Laura?
Yeah, on that note, I had written down bold mission, humble ask. I think there was some intrepidation when COVID initiated, where nonprofits were unsure of the receptivity of philanthropists, and that has completely shifted. So I always hate going last in these, but one of the things I was thinking is just to remember that the world is changing, but you are changing the world. And I think we've just got a great time right now to harness that. And that's what all nonprofits have the opportunity to be on the forefront of.
Wow, I just want to thank our panel. You all have been terrific. And thank you again for spending this time with us. We've heard a number of key insights and data points that gives me hope about where we are in this new era of philanthropy, an era where I see a shift in thinking from not just being capacity building to resiliency building, a shift where donors are primed to give with a renewed sense of purpose, while expanding the definition of philanthropy, a shift where nonprofits shed some of the barnacles that may have diluted their impact and focus on the core. And lastly, a shift where philanthropy is a driver for change, where every voice matters. I want to thank our panelists again. I want to thank Sharon for her excellent job of reporting out on the 2019 data. I want to thank our attendees. I want to thank the attendees for the work that you do day in and day out to lift up humanity and elevate the human spirit. We will get through this together, stronger and better. So I want to thank you all. And I want to turn it over to Lucinda for a really quick reminder about the survey. Lucinda?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all so much for joining. We hope that you enjoyed this and found some tips and useful information to take back for your work. A very quick reminder that you can use our discount code to purchase any and all Giving USA products at 30% off. So just head to the givingusa.org website and use our code, which is here on your screen, which is simply Alford. We will be sending out an email later today with the full recording of today's event, along with the slides that Karen shared and the Giving USA infographic. So all of that information will be available to you later today. Once we conclude here in just a minute, you'll be prompted to complete a very short survey. We encourage you to take it. It's truly very short, and it will provide us with valuable feedback for future sessions and webinars. With that, thank you so much for joining. If we didn't have a chance to answer your question, please contact us. info@alford.com is the easiest way to get a hold of us. You can reach us there. We definitely want to hear your questions, comments, and ideas. So send us an email. We also have a COVID-19 resource toolkit. The direct link is here on your screen. You can also access it from our homepage at alford.com. So thank you again for joining. Thank you to all of our panelists.
Yay.
Take care. This will conclude our session. We will now disconnect. I hope everyone has a really great day. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Be safe. Bye.